My name is Lieutenant Harper. I serve in the United States Navy. And what happened on my wedding day is not the kind of story people expect when they hear wedding. Most weddings start with flowers, music, and proud parents beaming from the front row. Mine started with silence and an empty chair. The one seat that mattered most was left untouched because my father chose not to be there. He wasn't just any man. He was Commander Joseph Harper, a Navy officer who taught recruits how to break under pressure and rebuild from the ashes. At home, he did the same to me. I was his only child, raised like a soldier, never like a daughter. There were no bedtime stories, just morning drills. I used to believe that if I followed every rule, if I stood taller, ran faster, stayed quieter, I'd earn his approval. It never came. Not when I graduated top of my class. Not when I earned my commission. And definitely not when I told him I was getting married. So, when I stood there on the dock in full dress whites, about to walk down the aisle alone, I thought I knew how this story would end. I thought I'd carry that final silence with me, like a medal I didn't ask for. But I was wrong. Because something happened that day. Something so unexpected, it stopped me in my tracks and changed everything I thought I understood about my father, about service, and about what it means to be seen. It wasn't loud, it wasn't public. But it broke through years of steel and silence. I'm telling you this now because weddings aren't always the whole story. Sometimes, the real story starts when someone doesn't show up. And sometimes, it takes missing someone to finally understand what they've been carrying all along. This isn't about revenge or bitterness. It's about clarity. And in the next few minutes, I'm going to take you with me through the moments that reshape the way I see love, duty, and forgiveness. Not in a fairy tale way, but in a way that's raw, quiet, and deeply, painfully real. So if you're still with me, take a breath. You're about to see what happens when a daughter stops waiting and learns to walk forward anyway. Growing up with my father felt less like childhood and more like basic training. He wasn't a bedtime story, hugs on demand kind of dad. He was a former Navy commander who never really left the service. Not in spirit, not in posture, and definitely not in how he raised me. Our home wasn't filled with warmth. It was orderly, silent, and clean to the point of sterility. Every towel had its fold, every shoe its place, and every mistake had a consequence. Lateness was a weakness. Crying was disrespectful. Emotions weren't welcomed. They were corrected. By the time I was 10, I knew how to shine my shoes to inspection standards and press a shirt with perfect creases. I also knew not to knock on his door after 2100 hours. That's how he said it. 2100. Even our dinner conversations felt like debriefings. Brief. Direct. Controlled. I used to stare at my friends' dads at school events. The way they clapped too loudly or shouted, "That's my girl," from the bleachers. Mine never showed up. If he did, he stood at the back, arms crossed, nodding once at the end like a commander reviewing a drill team. Pride wasn't something he showed. It was something you assumed if you passed the test. I spent years chasing that nod. Straight A's. Swim team captain. Perfect behavior. Every ribbon, every trophy. I lined them up on the kitchen counter like evidence in a court case, hoping it would finally convince him. Sometimes he'd glance at them. Most times, he'd just say, "Don't let it go to your head." He wasn't cruel, not in the way some fathers are. He never hit me, never raised his voice. But he never raised his hand to comfort me either. I remember scraping my knee badly during a bike ride. Blood ran down my leg. He handed me a towel and said, "You're tougher than that." I believed him. I wanted to be. After my mom passed away, things got quieter, colder. I was 12. He didn't cry at her funeral. He saluted the casket. I tried to hold his hand that day, but he pulled away, gently, like I was breaking protocol. From then on, I stopped trying to reach for him. There's a special kind of loneliness in being raised by someone who lives in the same house, but exists in a different world. He was always on time, always present, but emotionally, he was oceans away. That's the irony. He'd spent decades at sea, but never learned how to navigate the tides inside his own home. I learned not to ask for affection. I learned to predict his moods by the way he set down his coffee cup. I learned that if I wanted to feel seen, I had to perform. I had to achieve. There was no room for softness. Not in his navy. Not in our house. Sometimes I wonder if he even saw me as a daughter. Or if I was just another recruit under his roof. He taught me discipline, sure. Strength. Structure. But he never taught me how to be vulnerable. Or how to believe I was worthy of love without earning it. And that stuck with me. It shaped how I walked into every room, how I held my shoulders back, how I bit my tongue, even when it ached to scream. I didn't become a Navy officer to follow his path. I did it because it was the only language I thought he might understand. I told myself I joined the Navy because it was the only language he might understand. But if I'm being honest, I didn't join to honor him. I joined to escape him. The sea offered something he never had space to breathe. It wasn't a rebellion. It was survival. I needed distance, not just miles, but from the silence, the weight, the way he looked at me like I was always one mistake away from failing inspection. People assumed it was legacy, like I was following in his footsteps. But the truth is, I never wanted to walk where he did. I wanted to prove I could walk on my own, away from his shadow, away from the cold standard he wrapped around me like armor I never asked to wear. The first day of basic training was hell, but it felt familiar. Orders, structure, early mornings, pain. I knew that language. What surprised me was how much I wanted to win. Not to beat anyone else, just to prove, to myself mostly, that I wasn't just surviving my upbringing, I was stronger because of it. I learned fast. Kept my mouth shut. Ran faster. Listened harder. I pushed through injuries, sleep deprivation, and mental walls. There was this moment during our sea survival course. We were floating, half delirious, waves crashing over us. One guy cracked. I kept swimming, because I knew what it felt like to drown silently and keep going. That's the difference. The Navy tested me physically. My father tested me emotionally. One bruised my body. The other shaped my spine. It wasn't long before I started earning recognition. Not just for endurance, but leadership. I learned how to read people. How to de-escalate chaos. How to hold a team together, even when everything was falling apart. I got promoted fast. Too fast for some. There were whispers that I got special treatment because of my name. I hated that. Because if they only knew how little that name ever gave me, they'd understand I wasn't riding on a legacy. I was rewriting one. When I got orders for my first command, I didn't call him. I didn't want his reaction. I wanted to enjoy it without bracing for disappointment. But word travels fast. He sent a text the next day. Understood you made lieutenant. Good. Don't let it go to your head. That was it. No. Congrats. No. I'm proud of you. Just a warning. Not to feel too much. I stared at that message for a long time. Then I deleted it. Later, when I stood on the bridge of my ship for the first time, uniform pressed, nameplate shining, I thought of him. I thought of how he used to bark orders from behind a desk, and how I now stood where men twice my age had once stood. I was leading. And I did it without ever hearing the words I wanted most. There was no ceremony, no celebration, but I knew. I'd crossed a line he never thought I could. Not as a daughter, not even as a sailor, but as myself. And that, more than any medal, more than any salute, was the moment I felt free. I met Daniel during a joint operation drill in Hawaii. He worked on submarines, kept mostly to himself, and had a way of moving like he belonged in the quiet. Where I was sharp edges and command presence, he was calm hands and quiet eyes. At first, I didn't even notice him. But one night, after a 12-hour shift, we both ended up sitting on a dock, shoes off, watching the water move like it had nowhere else to be. I don't remember what I said first. Probably something short and defensive. He just listened. That was the thing with Daniel. He didn't fill the space. He gave you room to be in it. We started talking more. Nothing heavy, just music, old movies, and favorite ports. He never once asked me about my father, my rank, or my past. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I had to prove anything. He saw me as I was, not the version I'd armored up to become. Our connection grew slowly, like a tide over stone. We were different in all the usual ways. He'd grown up with 3 sisters and a dad who hugged too much. I grew up learning to salute before I could spell. And yet, we fit. Not because we filled each other's gaps, but because we didn't try to fix them. When he proposed, it wasn't some elaborate scene. We were back on that same dock, our boots beside us, water soft against the pilings. He pulled out a simple silver ring, tied to a bit of old sailor's rope. "I don't care where the sea takes us," he said. "I just want to navigate it with you." I said yes, no hesitation. But the next morning, the weight returned. I kept thinking about how my father would respond. Would he ignore it like every other milestone? Would he see it as a weakness? Would he even show up? Daniel never pressured me. He didn't ask what I'd tell my dad, or when. He just held my hand a little tighter every time I drifted too far into my own thoughts. Somehow, he knew the battle I was fighting had nothing to do with him, and everything to do with the one man I still wasn't ready to confront. The ceremony was held at Pier 32, just before sunset. The sky had that golden blue haze that made everything look softer, like the world knew something sacred was about to happen. Rows of white chairs lined the dock, their shadows stretched long over the wooden planks. Each one was filled with faces I knew from every chapter of my service. But one chair, the one in the front row on the left, remained empty. It wasn't reserved with a sign or flowers. It didn't need one. Everyone knew whose seat it was. Some people glanced at it, then quickly looked away, like staring too long might invite discomfort. I tried not to look at it at all. I stood behind the double doors of the shipyard office, dressed in my white Navy uniform. Not a gown. No veil. Just ribbons, medals, polished shoes, and a sword at my side. My hair was pulled back. My spine was straight. My chest was tight. There was no music yet, just the creak of the dock under the weight of the moment. I could hear my own heartbeat, louder than the seagulls. The plan was simple. I would walk alone. I had told myself I didn't care, that I didn't need him there, that I had carried myself this far, and I could carry myself the rest of the way. But just before the doors opened, I felt the weight of that lie settle hard in my chest. The coordinator gave the signal. The music began, low and steady. I stepped forward. Each step felt like walking into a memory I hadn't earned. Not the fairy tale kind. The kind where you're the only one clapping at your own milestone. That's when I saw him. Colonel Simmons, retired. My first commanding officer. The man who once chewed me out in front of an entire battalion because I flinched in a storm. He was standing near the edge of the aisle, dressed in full formal attire, clean-shaven, posture perfect. He stepped forward and said, just loud enough for me to hear, "Permission to escort you, Lieutenant?" My breath caught. For a second, I froze. Then I nodded. Not with emotion, not with words. Just a silent agreement between two people who had been forged in the same fire. He extended his arm. I took it, and together we walked. The crowd rose. Not out of tradition, but out of something else. Respect, maybe. Recognition that even when one family fails to show up, another sometimes does. My eyes didn't water, but something shifted inside me, like I wasn't carrying the weight alone anymore. As we stepped down the aisle, I kept my gaze forward. I didn't let myself look at the empty chair, but out of the corner of my eye, I saw it again. Still untouched, still silent, still him. Daniel stood at the end, waiting, his face calm but full. He didn't look surprised to see Colonel Simmons. He didn't look around for my father. He just looked at me like he always did, like I was enough. When we reached him, Colonel Simmons didn't say a word. He saluted me, then Daniel. Then he stepped back, blending into the crowd, like the professional he always was. But before he left, he leaned in and whispered, "Proud of you, Harper." That broke something in me I didn't know was holding. Not tears, not yet, but something deeper. Something that had been waiting years, just to be seen. We finished the vows as the sun dropped behind the harbor. The ocean shimmered like glass. The wind lifted just enough to move the hem of my uniform. And when we kissed, it wasn't just the end of a ceremony. It was the end of waiting. Later, as the guests clapped and the music picked up, I glanced back once more. The chair was still empty, but it didn't feel like it defined the day anymore. It was just a chair, because in that moment, I realized something. I hadn't walked alone. The guests were gone. The dock was quiet again, just the hum of the harbor lights and the soft creak of the ropes against the pilings. I walked back out alone, needing a breath, needing stillness. The kind of silence that doesn't ache anymore. That's when I saw it. An envelope, weathered at the corners, was tucked beneath a rusted cleat on the railing. My name, written in a small, sharp print that I knew as well as my own. For a second, I thought someone had forgotten a card, maybe one of the sailors. But then I touched it, and my chest tightened. The paper was stiff, military-grade stationery. My name, Lieutenant H. Harper. Not Harper, not sweetheart, not anything soft. I opened it right there, the ocean behind me. His handwriting was clean, bare, efficient, as always. But the words inside cracked something wide open. He wrote that he came. He stood behind a cargo crate and watched the whole thing. He saw me walk down the aisle with Simmons and almost stepped forward. But didn't, because he didn't think he had the right. He said he failed, that he built walls instead of bridges. He taught me how to stand tall but never how to rest. That he watched me become everything he couldn't say out loud, he was proud of, and that maybe it was time to try something different. The letter ended with one line: no uniforms, no protocol. Just a father asking if his daughter will let him try again. I didn't cry. Not there. Not then. I just folded the letter back into its envelope and pressed it against my chest. My hands were steady, but my heart wasn't. For so long, I had convinced myself that silence was his final answer, that if he wasn't going to speak, I wasn't going to wait. And yet, here he was, speaking, in the only way he knew how. He didn't show up the way I wanted, but maybe he showed up the way he could. And maybe, just maybe, that was a start. 6 months after the wedding, I stood behind a podium, under a white tent draped in flags and medals. The event was the 50th anniversary of women serving in the U.S. Navy. Rows of decorated officers, cadets, and civilians filled the lawn, their uniforms crisp, their attention fixed. I had been asked to speak about legacy, about strength, about the invisible weight that women in uniform carry, and how we turn it into something unshakable. My words were measured. My tone was steady. But inside, I felt every beat of the past echo against my chest. When I finished, the audience stood. Applause rose and then softened. I stepped down from the stage, heels clicking on the wooden steps, sun warm against my back. That's when I saw him. He was standing beneath a tree near the rear fence, away from the crowd. No uniform, no ribbons, just khakis, a plain navy blazer, and that unmistakable bearing he could never quite shake. For a moment, he didn't move. Then slowly, he raised his hand in a full, formal salute. Not rushed, not performative, steady, respectful, intentional. I stopped where I was. For a second, I forgot how to breathe. No one else noticed him. No one else saw the weight of what that gesture carried. But I did. I had spent my life trying to earn it. I stood up straight. I returned the salute. And in that moment, something passed between us. Not rank, not duty, not unfinished conversations, or missed birthdays. Just understanding, forgiveness, a kind of peace you don't announce. You just feel. He didn't approach me after. He didn't need to. The salute had said more than words ever could. Later, someone asked why I looked so still after the speech. I told them it was the breeze, but really, it was something deeper. Something was finally settling inside me. For the first time, he saluted me first. And I let that be enough. For most of my life, I thought I had to earn his love by becoming the version of a daughter he could respect. I tried to outwork his silence, to outrank his absence, to build myself in the image of a soldier when all I wanted was to be seen as a daughter. But somewhere along the way, I stopped chasing his approval. Not out of anger, but because I realized it would never define who I am. I didn't need to become softer to be loved or harder to be respected. I just needed to be whole. I've led sailors through storms, made calls that carried weight, stood in rooms where no one expected a woman to lead, and I led anyway. I've stood in front of my husband, my crew, and eventually my father, not as his reflection, but as my own person. Independent, resilient, forged in fire, but not owned by it. He never said, "I love you." Not once. But that salute, 6 months ago, held something different. It wasn't pride in my rank. It wasn't regret for what we missed. It was a gesture from man to woman, officer to officer, and quietly, finally, father to daughter. That moment didn't fix everything. It didn't rewrite the past. But it permitted me to let go of the weight I had carried for so long. To accept that sometimes people show up the only way they know how. And sometimes that has to be enough. I am not his shadow. I am the captain of my own ship. And I've learned that the deepest strength comes not from who we follow, but from having the courage to chart our own course. So if you're watching this and waiting for someone to hand you your worth, stop waiting. Build it yourself. Live it out loud. Because the salute you're waiting for may never come. But your life doesn't start when someone finally sees you. It starts the moment you see yourself.